The narcissist never expected the departure because over time they convinced themselves that the empath's loyalty was unconditional. They became accustomed to a pattern where no matter how much emotional pain they caused, no matter how many promises they broke, and no matter how often they crossed boundaries, the empath remained. What began as gratitude for someone's patience slowly transformed into entitlement. The narcissist started viewing the empath's compassion not as a gift, but as something guaranteed. They believed the empath would always be there to absorb the tension, repair the damage, and restore the relationship whenever conflict arose. This belief became deeply rooted because the empath had repeatedly demonstrated an extraordinary willingness to forgive and try again. The narcissist often studies people more carefully than others realize. They pay attention to emotional reactions, fears, insecurities, and attachment patterns. Through repeated interactions, they learn what keeps someone connected to them. They discover which words trigger guilt, which actions provoke sympathy, and which situations create enough emotional confusion to prevent the other person from leaving. When dealing with an empath, the narcissist quickly notices a powerful trait. The empath genuinely wants to understand. While most people walk away after repeated mistreatment, the empath keeps searching for explanations. They want to know why the narcissist behaves the way they do. They want to understand the wounds behind the behavior. They want to believe there is a solution that can restore harmony. At first, this quality seems admirable, and in many healthy relationships it is. The desire to understand others can strengthen trust and deepen connection. However, in a toxic dynamic, this same quality can become a trap. The narcissist learns that every time they create pain, the empath searches for reasons rather than consequences. Every time they disappoint, the empath focuses on understanding instead of walking away. This pattern teaches the narcissist a dangerous lesson. They are unlikely to lose the relationship regardless of how they behave. As months or years pass, the narcissist becomes increasingly confident in their position. They begin to assume that the empath's love is permanent. They stop valuing the relationship because they no longer fear losing it. Human beings often appreciate what they know can disappear, but when something seems guaranteed, gratitude can slowly vanish. The narcissist starts taking the empath's presence for granted. They believe they can withdraw affection, offer attention only when convenient, and continue placing their own needs above everyone else's because the empath has always remained loyal before. What the narcissist fails to understand is that the empath's loyalty is not infinite. It may be stronger than most people's loyalty, but it is not endless. The empath continues giving because they believe there is hope. They continue trying because they see potential. They continue loving because they value commitment. Yet every disappointment leaves a mark. Every betrayal creates another crack in the foundation. Every broken promise weakens the trust that once held everything together. The damage is often invisible because the empath rarely announces it. They continue showing up, continue caring, and continue supporting the relationship long after they have begun hurting deeply inside. This is why the narcissist is often blindsided when the departure finally happens. They mistake silence for acceptance. They mistake patience for unlimited tolerance. They mistake endurance for permanent attachment. While they assume everything is secure, the empath is quietly reaching a breaking point. The emotional exhaustion accumulates little by little. It does not arrive all at once. It builds through countless moments when the empath feels unheard, unappreciated, manipulated, or emotionally drained. Each experience adds another layer of fatigue until eventually something shifts within them. The shift is rarely dramatic. In fact, it is often surprisingly calm. The empath reaches a moment where they stop trying to convince the narcissist to change. They stop arguing. They stop explaining their pain repeatedly. They stop fighting for understanding. Instead of becoming louder, they become quieter. Instead of becoming more emotional, they become more observant. They begin seeing the relationship for what it truly is rather than what they hoped it could become. The illusions that once sustained them begin to disappear. The narcissist usually misinterprets this change. They assume the empath is simply going through another phase of frustration. They believe a few reassuring words, a temporary display of affection, or a familiar manipulation tactic will restore the old dynamic. After all, those methods worked before. The narcissist does not realize that something fundamental has changed. The empath is no longer operating from hope alone. They are operating from clarity. Clarity is dangerous to a narcissist's control because it removes confusion. The empath starts recognizing recurring patterns instead of isolated incidents. They notice that apologies rarely lead to lasting change. They see that promises are often followed by the same behaviors. They understand that the cycle continues because it benefits the narcissist. Once this awareness takes hold, the emotional grip begins weakening. The departure itself often feels shocking to the narcissist because it seems sudden from their perspective. One day, the empath is still present, still engaged, and still trying. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, they are gone. What the narcissist does not understand is that the decision was made long before the physical departure occurred. The empath left emotionally in stages. They left each time their trust was violated. They left each time their feelings were dismissed. They left each time they realized their efforts were not being matched. By the time they physically walk away, much of the emotional separation has already taken place. The narcissist struggles to comprehend this because they were never paying attention to the empath's internal experience. Their focus remained on maintaining access, maintaining control, and maintaining the benefits of the relationship. They assumed the empath's compassion guaranteed permanence. They assumed the bond would survive indefinitely because it always had before. They never imagined that the very person who endured the most would eventually become the one who leaves for good. When that day arrives, the narcissist is forced to confront something they never believed possible. The person they considered impossible to lose has finally chosen themselves. The one who kept forgiving has stopped negotiating with pain. The one who kept returning has decided not to come back. And the greatest surprise is not that the empath walked away. The greatest surprise is that the narcissist never saw it coming, even though the warning signs had been accumulating for years. The super empath's breaking point is not a single event, a single argument, or a single betrayal. It is the result of countless moments that accumulate over time, creating an emotional burden so heavy that even the strongest heart can no longer carry it. Many people assume that a super empath leaves because they suddenly stop caring, but the truth is often the exact opposite. They leave because they cared for too long, gave too much, and ignored their own needs for so many years that eventually there was nothing left to give. Their breaking point is not born from a lack of love. It is born from the painful realization that love alone cannot sustain a relationship when only one person is investing in its survival. A super empath naturally sees the best in people. They look beyond flaws and imperfections. They notice qualities that others overlook. When someone behaves poorly, the super empath often searches for the hidden pain behind the behavior rather than immediately judging the person. This ability allows them to build deep connections, offer meaningful support, and create safe spaces where others feel understood. However, this same strength can become a source of vulnerability when they become involved with someone who consistently takes advantage of their compassion. In the beginning, the super empath usually believes that patience will make a difference. They think understanding will create healing. They hope that kindness will inspire growth. Every disappointment is viewed as temporary. Every hurtful moment is treated as a misunderstanding that can be resolved. Even when they feel wounded, they focus on solutions rather than escape. They tell themselves that every relationship has challenges and that difficult seasons eventually pass. As time goes on, the super empath begins carrying more and more emotional responsibility. They become the peacemaker after every conflict. They become the encourager whenever the other person feels insecure. They become the forgiver whenever trust is broken. They become the emotional support system that holds everything together. While the relationship may appear functional from the outside, much of the work required to maintain it is being performed by one person. The problem is that emotional energy is not unlimited. Every act of forgiveness requires strength. Every sacrifice requires effort. Every attempt to repair damage requires emotional resources. When these investments are not reciprocated, the super empath slowly begins operating at a deficit. They continue giving, but they receive less and less in return. They continue supporting others while their own needs remain neglected. At first, the exhaustion is subtle. It may appear as occasional sadness, frustration, or disappointment. The empath convinces themselves that things will improve if they remain patient. They focus on the good moments and use them as evidence that the relationship can still become healthy. Whenever doubts arise, they push those doubts aside because they genuinely want the connection to succeed. Unfortunately, repeated patterns have a way of revealing the truth. The same problems keep returning, the same promises continue being broken, the same conversations lead nowhere, the same emotional wounds are reopened again and again. What once seemed like isolated incidents begins to look like a cycle. This realization creates an internal conflict. Part of the empath still believes in the potential for change. Another part begins recognizing reality. These two perspectives battle within them for a long time. Their heart tells them to stay and keep trying. Their growing awareness tells them that nothing meaningful is changing. The tension between hope and reality becomes emotionally exhausting. One of the most painful aspects of reaching the breaking point is recognizing how much of oneself has been sacrificed. The super empath starts noticing that their confidence has diminished, their peace has disappeared, their happiness depends heavily on the moods and behaviors of another person. They realize they have spent so much time trying to rescue the relationship that they have neglected their own well-being. Many super empaths reach a stage where they no longer recognize themselves. The vibrant, confident, compassionate person they once were feels distant. Their energy is depleted. Their emotional reserves are running low. Activities that once brought joy now feel difficult. Their focus becomes consumed by managing problems, preventing conflicts, and maintaining stability in an environment that continuously drains them. Yet even at this stage, they often continue trying. This is what makes the breaking point so misunderstood. Most people would have left much earlier. The super empath stays because they genuinely believe that persistence can make a difference. They continue offering chances long after others would have walked away. They continue extending grace even when that grace is rarely appreciated. However, every human being has limits. There comes a moment when the empath finally accepts a painful truth. They realize that they cannot force another person to grow. They cannot heal someone who refuses accountability. They cannot love another person into becoming someone different. No amount of sacrifice can compensate for a lack of willingness on the other side. This realization is heartbreaking because it requires letting go of the future they imagined. The empath is not simply mourning the relationship itself, they are mourning the dreams attached to it. They are grieving the possibility they believed in. They are releasing the hope that one day everything would finally make sense and become healthy. When the breaking point arrives, it often brings an unexpected sense of clarity. The empath stops viewing the relationship through the lens of potential and starts viewing it through the lens of reality. They begin evaluating actions rather than promises. They focus on patterns instead of isolated moments. They recognize that genuine change requires consistent effort, not occasional displays of remorse or temporary improvements. The emotional exhaustion that once created confusion now produces certainty. The empath no longer feels compelled to explain their pain repeatedly. They no longer feel responsible for convincing someone else to care. They stop chasing understanding from people who have repeatedly demonstrated an unwillingness to provide it. The breaking point does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it appears as calm detachment. Sometimes it appears as silence. Sometimes it appears as a simple decision to stop participating in a cycle that has caused years of emotional harm. The outward behavior may seem small, but internally it represents one of the most significant transformations of the empath's life. For the first time, they begin directing the compassion they once reserved exclusively for others toward themselves. They acknowledge their own pain. They honor their own needs. They recognize that self-sacrifice is not the same as love and that protecting their well-being is not selfish. The breaking point is not the moment the super empath stops caring. It is the moment they stop abandoning themselves. It is the moment they realize that loyalty should never require self-destruction, that compassion should never demand endless suffering, and that a healthy relationship cannot be built by one person alone. The years of disappointment, emotional labor, broken trust, and unmet needs finally lead to a powerful awakening in which the super empath understands that continuing the cycle would cost far more than ending it. The shift from saving to self-preservation is one of the most profound transformations a super empath can experience. For a long time, the super empath believes their purpose is to help, heal, encourage, and rescue the people they love. They naturally gravitate toward those who are struggling because they see possibilities where others see problems. They see wounded hearts behind difficult behaviors, hidden pain beneath anger, and insecurity beneath arrogance. Their instinct is not to run from brokenness, but to move toward it with compassion. This ability makes them extraordinary sources of support, but it can also lead them into relationships where they carry burdens that were never theirs to carry. At the beginning, the desire to help feels noble. The empath believes that patience, understanding, and unconditional support can make a meaningful difference in someone's life. They willingly invest their time, energy, and emotions because they genuinely care. When the other person struggles, the empath feels responsible for providing comfort. When conflicts arise, the empath feels responsible for restoring peace. When emotional wounds appear, the empath feels responsible for helping them heal. Over time, this sense of responsibility begins to grow beyond healthy limits. The empath gradually starts taking ownership of problems they did not create. They become emotionally invested in fixing situations that are ultimately outside of their control. Instead of allowing others to face the consequences of their actions, they step in repeatedly to absorb the damage. They smooth over conflicts, make excuses, offer endless chances, and continue giving even when very little is being returned. The shift happens so gradually that the empath often does not realize it is occurring. What begins as compassion slowly evolves into over-responsibility. They start believing that if they just try harder, understand more deeply, communicate more effectively, or love more consistently, they can eventually create change. Every setback becomes a challenge to overcome rather than a warning sign to consider. As this pattern continues, the empath's focus becomes increasingly directed outward. Their attention centers on the needs, emotions, and struggles of the other person. They spend hours analyzing problems, searching for solutions, and looking for ways to improve the relationship. Meanwhile, their own emotional needs begin receiving less attention. Their exhaustion is ignored, their disappointment is minimized, their pain is pushed aside, because there is always another crisis demanding their focus. One of the most difficult realities for a super empath to accept is that helping and rescuing are not the same thing. Helping empowers people to take responsibility for their own growth. Rescuing removes responsibility from them and places it onto someone else's shoulders. Many empaths do not realize they have crossed this line because their intentions remain good. They genuinely want to support others. However, support becomes unhealthy when it consistently comes at the expense of their own well-being. As the years pass, emotional fatigue begins to accumulate. The empath notices they are constantly giving but rarely receiving the same level of care in return. They realize they are expected to understand everyone else's feelings, while their own feelings are frequently overlooked. They become aware that they are carrying an emotional load far heavier than any one person should be expected to bear. This growing awareness creates discomfort because it challenges a deeply held belief. The empath has often measured their value through what they can do for others. They feel needed when they are solving problems. They feel important when they are providing support. They feel useful when they are helping someone through difficulties. Letting go of this role can feel frightening because it requires redefining their identity. Eventually, however, reality becomes impossible to ignore. The empath begins noticing that despite years of effort, many of the same issues remain unchanged. The same cycles repeat themselves. The same promises are broken. The same emotional wounds reopen again and again. No matter how much energy they invest, the outcome remains largely the same. This realization can be painful because it forces the empath to confront an uncomfortable truth. Not every person wants to be saved. Some people want comfort without accountability. Some people want support without growth. Some people want the benefits of change without the effort required to achieve it. The empath begins understanding that personal transformation cannot be forced from the outside. It must be chosen from within. As this understanding deepens, something remarkable begins to happen. The empath starts asking questions they have avoided for years. What do I need? What am I feeling? What has this relationship cost me emotionally? What would happen if I stopped carrying responsibilities that do not belong to me? These questions mark the beginning of self-preservation. For the first time, the empath starts directing attention inward instead of exclusively outward. They begin recognizing that their emotional health matters, their peace matters, their happiness matters. Their boundaries matter. This may sound obvious to others, but for someone who has spent years prioritizing everyone else, it represents a major shift in perspective. The empath slowly learns that protecting themselves is not selfish. They discover that boundaries are not punishments. Boundaries are acts of self-respect. They exist to protect emotional well-being, preserve mental health, and create space for healthy relationships to flourish. Instead of feeling guilty for saying no, the empath begins understanding that every healthy relationship requires limits. As self-preservation develops, the empath becomes less willing to participate in destructive patterns. They stop rushing to solve every problem. They stop accepting responsibility for choices made by others. They stop sacrificing their own peace to maintain relationships that consistently drain them. This does not mean they become cold or uncaring. Their compassion remains intact. The difference is that their compassion is now guided by wisdom. Wisdom teaches them that they can care about someone without carrying them. They can love someone without rescuing them. They can support someone without sacrificing themselves. They can offer understanding without tolerating mistreatment. This new perspective creates a profound sense of freedom. The empath no longer feels trapped by the belief that they must fix everything. They recognize that their value does not depend on how much suffering they can endure. They understand that being a good person does not require accepting endless emotional pain. Perhaps the most transformative part of self-preservation is the rediscovery of personal identity. The empath begins reconnecting with dreams, interests, passions, and goals that were neglected while they were focused on saving others. Their energy starts returning. Their confidence grows stronger. Their sense of peace becomes more consistent. They realize how much of themselves they lost while trying to become everything for someone else. What once felt selfish now feels necessary. Taking care of themselves is no longer viewed as a betrayal of others. It is recognized as a responsibility. The empath finally understands that they cannot pour endlessly from an empty cup. They cannot continue giving what they no longer possess. Their own well-being deserves the same care, compassion, and attention they have spent years offering to everyone around them. The shift from saving to self-preservation is not about abandoning people. It is about abandoning the belief that another person's healing is your responsibility. It is the moment the empath stops measuring love by sacrifice and starts measuring it by health, balance, and mutual respect. It is the moment they choose to protect their own heart with the same dedication they once used to protect everyone else. Quote, The narcissist loses their source of control the moment the super empath emotionally disconnects from the cycle that once kept the relationship functioning. For a very long time, the narcissist relies on a predictable pattern. They become accustomed to knowing how the empath will respond, what buttons can be pushed, what emotions can be triggered, and what tactics will produce the desired outcome, whether through guilt, manipulation, criticism, charm, affection, or emotional withdrawal. The narcissist learns how to influence the empath's behavior. This influence gradually becomes one of the foundations upon which the relationship is built. Control is often misunderstood. Many people imagine it only as obvious domination, threats, or demands. In reality, control can be much more subtle. It can appear through emotional dependency, selective affection, guilt-inducing conversations, constant criticism, unpredictable behavior, or the strategic withholding of approval. The narcissist may not always control every aspect of the empath's life, but they become highly invested in controlling how the empath thinks, feels, reacts, and responds. The super empath becomes an especially valuable source of control because of their emotional sensitivity. They care deeply about harmony, connection, and understanding. They are highly responsive to the emotional needs of others. They notice tension quickly and often feel compelled to resolve it. The narcissist learns to use these qualities to maintain influence. Whenever conflict arises, the empath works hard to repair it. Whenever distance develops, the empath seeks reconnection. Whenever problems appear, the empath searches for solutions. Over time, the narcissist begins depending on this dynamic. They expect the empath to chase conversations, initiate reconciliation, and absorb emotional responsibility. They assume that no matter how difficult things become, the empath will eventually return to restore balance. This expectation creates a sense of security. The narcissist feels confident because they believe the relationship revolves around their needs and preferences. One of the most powerful forms of control comes through emotional reactions. Narcissists often draw energy from knowing they can influence another person's emotional state. When a critical comment creates insecurity, they feel powerful. When a silent treatment creates anxiety, they feel influential. When a guilt trip causes the empath to abandon their own needs, they feel effective. The ability to provoke emotional responses becomes proof that they still have access to the other person's inner world. The super empath unknowingly reinforces this dynamic for years because they genuinely care. They react emotionally because the relationship matters to them. They engage in difficult conversations because they want resolution. They explain their feelings because they hope to be understood. They remain invested because they believe healthy communication can solve problems. Unfortunately, the narcissist often interprets this investment as evidence that their control remains intact. The situation begins changing when the empath starts developing clarity. They slowly realize that many conflicts are not misunderstandings, but repeating patterns. They recognize that certain behaviors are designed to maintain influence rather than create genuine connection. The empath becomes less focused on defending themselves and more focused on observing what is actually happening. This shift is subtle but significant. Instead of reacting immediately, they pause. Instead of becoming emotionally overwhelmed, they become more aware. Instead of chasing explanations, they start recognizing patterns. The narcissist notices something different but often misunderstands what it means. They assume the empath is simply upset, frustrated, or temporarily distant. They expect the old dynamic to return. What they fail to realize is that the empath is beginning to reclaim emotional ownership. As this process continues, the empath stops providing the reactions that once fueled the narcissist's sense of control. Criticism no longer produces the same level of insecurity. Emotional manipulation no longer creates immediate compliance. Silent treatments no longer generate panic. The narcissist discovers that the methods that worked for years are becoming less effective. This is often deeply unsettling because control depends on predictability. The narcissist feels secure when they know how someone will respond. When those responses change, uncertainty enters the relationship. Suddenly, the narcissist cannot rely on the same emotional strategies. They find themselves facing a version of the empath that is becoming increasingly independent. One of the most significant losses occurs when the narcissist realizes they no longer control the empath's self-worth. For years, the empath may have looked to the relationship for validation, approval, or reassurance. The narcissist could influence confidence through praise or criticism because the empath valued their opinion. However, as healing begins, the empath starts rebuilding confidence from within. Their sense of worth becomes less dependent on external validation. This transformation removes one of the narcissist's most effective tools. If criticism no longer destroys confidence, its power diminishes. If approval is no longer desperately needed, its value decreases. The narcissist discovers that influence becomes much harder to maintain when the empath develops a stable sense of self. Another major loss involves emotional access. The narcissist often expects unrestricted access to the empath's attention, energy, and compassion. They assume they can reach out whenever convenient and receive a response. They believe they can create emotional situations that pull the empath back into old patterns. When the empath establishes firm boundaries, that access becomes limited. Boundaries fundamentally alter the dynamic because they introduce consequences. The narcissist can no longer assume unlimited availability. They can no longer rely on endless forgiveness. They can no longer expect every emotional need to be prioritized above the empath's well-being. The relationship begins operating according to healthier principles rather than emotional control. What makes this especially difficult for the narcissist is that the empath's departure often removes a reliable source of emotional supply. The empath provided attention, understanding, reassurance, patience, and support. They invested enormous amounts of emotional energy into the relationship. Once that energy is no longer available, the narcissist experiences a significant loss. Many narcissists respond by attempting to regain control. They may become unusually charming, they may make promises of change, they may appeal to shared memories. They may present themselves as victims. They may create emergencies designed to trigger sympathy. These efforts are often attempts to restore a dynamic that once benefited them. The super empath's growth becomes evident when these tactics no longer achieve the desired result. The empath may still feel compassion, but compassion is no longer confused with obligation. They may still care, but caring no longer requires surrendering boundaries. They may still wish the other person well, but they are no longer willing to sacrifice themselves in order to maintain the connection. The narcissist gradually realizes that the person they once influenced so easily has changed. The emotional dependency that supported their control has weakened. The confusion that once created vulnerability has been replaced with clarity. The fear that once prevented departure has been replaced with self-respect. Perhaps the greatest loss of all is not simply losing the relationship. It is losing the certainty that the empath would always remain available regardless of how they were treated. The narcissist built expectations around that certainty. They believed the empath's loyalty was permanent, their forgiveness was unlimited, and their presence was guaranteed. When the empath steps out of the cycle and reclaims ownership of their life, those assumptions collapse. The source of control that once seemed secure is no longer accessible because the empath has learned that their emotions, their choices, their boundaries, and their future belong to them alone.